last time in our duck hunt game, we left it so that all of our enemy objects start moving simultaneously, which is just not an ideal situation. And when we are measuring or observing our collision or intersection, we're not doing anything with it. And those are two things that we are going to address in this video. So the first thing that we want to do is add in a new class. This class is going to be a timer class, and this is a utility class. Once we have this, we can just use it in any project we work on. Anytime we want to do a timer, we can use it for a countdown, we can use it to stage things, we can use it to control the speed of animation. So there's a lot of things that we can do with it. So we'll start out class timer with a capital T because it is a class name. And return twice, close curly brace, throw a little comment on, and end class. Now let's go up here, we'll have our properties, our constructor, and this will end up taking a parameter, which we will define that in a moment. But I always like to just get everything kind of stubbed in here. So with our timer is going to have two properties, and one will be our start time, and then one property will be the interval, which is how frequently our timer is going to effectively tick. So we can say we want it to be a 1 second interval, a fraction of a second, multiple seconds. We'll be looking at all of that here as we progress. So now when we create a timer, we want to pass into it that interval that we're looking for. So we'll just call it time interval. So when we say, I'm making a new instance of the timer, we will pass in a number, and that will be the time interval here. So then we set our interval equal to that time interval. So that's how we're able to take advantage of that, and it will make a little bit more sense once we start working with it. Now our timer just is going to have two methods. So the first will just be a start method, so it is a function type void. It doesn't return any value. So we'll just say start, curly, and start. Now our start time, this is where we actually, so when we call this, we want to take a measure of what is the current time according to our program. And now most programming languages have, start time. Most programming languages have a way of detecting how many milliseconds have elapsed since the beginning of or what is the current milliseconds since the program started running. And we do that by using the milli statement. So a millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. So we take a second, divide it into 1,000 little pieces. So it's fairly accurate. It's more than accurate for what we need as we work with this. So when we call the method start, we're setting our start time property equal to the number of milliseconds that have elapsed from when the program started running. So from when we hit the play button on our program. Now the next method that we're going to have is where we're going to be, every tick of our game program, so 60 times a second, we'll be asking a question of this timer and saying, hey, are you done yet? Hey, are you done yet? And it's going to return one of two values to us, true or false. So now I'll have a Boolean because this function will return a true or false value. And we'll just name our method complete. Put my closing comment. So if we get in the habit of doing our closing comments after our curly braces, it will make your code infinitely more readable over time. Don't hesitate to put in white space as well to make your code readable. Now you will notice that this Boolean is underlined right here with red. even though we haven't done anything that looks like it would be wrong. And it says the method must return a result of type Boolean. Okay, so we have to return something. So at some point we have to say return, and the two possible values we can return will be true or false. If we do that, say it goes away. But we don't want to return true yet because we need to put a little bit of logic inside this method. So I'll start out and say int elapsed time. So how much time has passed since we last called complete, and we'll compare the total amount of time since the program began minus when we called start time. So when we said start, so what is start time? So we're figuring out how much time has currently elapsed. Now if our elapsed time is greater than the interval, then what we want to do is return true. Curly brace else, close, or now another curly brace, otherwise we return false. So our elapsed time, we calculate that each time we use the complete method. If elapsed time is greater, so if we say we're looking for, our interval is 1 second, so if the elapsed time is greater than 1,000, remember, because we're talking thousandths of a second, so if it's greater than 1,000, it returns true, otherwise it returns false. So that is how our timer works. Just hit auto format on here, Control Command T just to clean up my spacing. That looks good. I'm just going to do a quick save. So file save, not save as. I use the keyboard shortcut, so Command or Control S. Now that saved out our timer class. Now we never have to touch that again. Now we can actually start using it in our program. So I'm going to use this in our program. What we want to do is to now add in a few more variables so we can use it. So the first is a timer variable. So timer, and we'll call this enemy timer. Now I need a couple additional variables to work with our timer here, and so that we can work with it. So I'll need the interval that I'm looking for how often I want to add a new enemy to my game. Then I need to know how many enemies I'm working with, and then I want to know how many enemies are currently active and moving on screen. So there's a couple different ways. I mean, we can keep track of the active enemies. We could make all of our enemies active, but we could then not be moving them so that their speeds would all be 0 until we activate them. Or in this case, we'll have our enemies, but we're not going to update or display them until they're active. So we'll be modifying our for loop down here on that. So now let's add this information in, and I'm going to add this information in at the top because we're going to tweak a little bit of what's underneath here as well, just to clean things up and make our code a little bit better. So our enemy interval is how often they're going to show up on screen. Right now I'm going to set it pretty high, and so we can really see a difference happen. So I'll say 2,000. That's 2 seconds. 2,000 milliseconds is 2 seconds. Now I want my number of enemies, and I'll just set that equal to 10, so it'll be similar to what we had before. And our active enemies is going to start out at 0. So we will increase that as we go. Now, we also need to create our timer. And our enemy timer will be a new timer object, and we will pass in our enemy interval. So that now has added in all of my different values. Now let's use those. So we're going to update enemies here, and we'll just say num. Well, let's try that again. So then if I want to just change my number of enemies there, it updates right here, and then we're in good shape. So that makes that a better way of coding that. Now, do make sure that you watch your spelling of enemies and enemies so you get your N's and M's and E's all in the right place. Otherwise, you will find that you will have errors in your code and you'll be like, it looks the same. And it's like, well, if it's not perfect, it's not going to work. So you do have to make sure you get it correct. Now, what we want to do is modify and put some stuff in here where we will say if our enemy timers, and I spelled it wrong right after, enemy timer complete. So we're asking that method. So if that is true, then we want to do something. So what I'll do is now and if timer, so we put in that comment. So if the timer is true, then we can say enemy timer dot start. So once the timer is done, we tell it to start again, and that resets start time to whatever the current time is. So once it's complete, then we reset start time to whatever the current time is, and then it goes until our elapsed time pings greater than the interval, and now we get true, then we reset start time to whatever the new current time is. It's an ever increasing number. So that allows us to just keep effectively running our timer or our stopwatch. Now, what we want to say is if active enemies is less than our number of enemies, and this is why we needed to store our number of enemies, because I don't want to go and type 10 here. If I do that and then now up here I decide, oh, I want 5 enemies, well, now this is going to break it because I'll be trying to use 10 enemies when I only have 5. So instead of hard coding a number in, so really the only place numbers should be hard coded is where you define their initial starting value. After that, numbers should only be defined in your setup or in a class during the constructor. So here we will then reference. So if our active enemies is, wow, I really mistyped that. For active enemies is less than our current number of enemies in our project, then what we're going to do is make active enemies go up by 1. Let's just go here and do a and if so end if active enemies. So this now increases the number of enemies. Now inside our for loop where we're updating and displaying, this is where instead of using enemies.length, we'll use active enemies. So now if I hit play, we'll see after 2 seconds one comes out, 2 more seconds later another one, that they're both moving, and now we have 3. So every 2 seconds I'm dropping another one out, and that I went with the 2 seconds. And if they continue to loop, you can see how it eventually it's now very organic. But again, it's much better. And we'll just modify, let's modify this down to say half a second. And if we look at that, we can see how it spaces them out so we don't get that whole clump happening. Now if I were to just put it down to 10 milliseconds here, it's like, we're back to how it was before. Or we could even just go with 1 millisecond. And this is pretty much making it how it was before. So if we compare that to something like every half second or 500, let's take a look there, that's more manageable. Now, again, depending on the speed of your enemies, the movement style that you're going to work out, all of these things, this number, this enemy interval, you'll just keep tweaking it until it feels right, till you get the right kind of gameplay happening with it. I'm going to go up to 1,000 just to slow it down a little bit more. Notice my stroke around my player changes when the first one comes out because the enemies have a stroke weight of 4. The player has no mention of stroke weight, so it takes on that stroke weight. So if I want it to be the same or different, I need to define it inside there. And eventually when we start drawing things, we might want to, so if I want this to be a skinnier stroke weight and it to stay skinny, I'll just go 2. But when we start drawing more complex objects for our player and enemy and move away from just a plain circle, then we will change all of those values. But this is part of the building process. We start with something basic and simple. We work out the mechanics before we spend precious time trying to create the graphics when we don't even know if the game works yet. So we always want to keep the main object as simple as possible just so we can work out the overall gameplay and then start putting that icing on the cake, putting that dress on the body, making it look good.